Thank you, Chair. My name is M.K. Sivajalingam and I elected member of the Northern Provincial Council in Sri Lanka. On behalf of the victimist Tamils, I would like to thank you all for your effort in seeking justice to the victims. The Tamil people in Sri Lanka have suffered tremendously for the last 67 years, and today more than ever they are counting on the UN and the international community to give them justice and assure their protection. The Tamil people are disappointed that the OHCHR report and the UNHRC resolution did not fully refer the issue to the ICC or a full international mechanism. I would like to respectfully request to you consider the following. Number one, the OHCHR should open its offices in the northeast region where the crimes were committed so that it can facilitate the victims to have access to OHCHR. Number two, the UN should press Sri Lanka to end the military occupation of the northeast region and create the normal condition for the Tamil people so that they will be able to participate in the judicial process without fear. Number three, the UN must provide and ensure protection of the witnesses. Number four, the UN must require Sri Lanka to accept a UN-mediated political solution towards finding a permanent political solution that can address the root cause of the war and prevent recurrence. Number five, please monitor the progress by Sri Lanka, and if no progress is made, the UNHRC must refer the issue to ICC or a fully international mechanism under the UN. Thank you.
Next speaker is Alliance Creative Community Project.
Our organization welcomes the OHCHR report for the fact that it is the most comprehensive fact-finding report thus far on the mass atrocities committed in Sri Lanka despite the limited time frame investigated. We also note with appreciation that the findings were despite OHCHR not having direct access to the victims and the physical evidence within Sri Lanka due to the non-cooperation of the previous and current regimes. We also welcome the report's recommendation that a comprehensive criminal investigation into the serious international crimes committed be undertaken and that the time frame to be investigated should at least cover the entire period of the war. In this regard, we find to be of utmost importance the report's findings that a domestic mechanism for such an investigation will not suffice due to the lack of capacity owing to the systematic distortion and corruption of security sector and judicial system in Sri Lanka by decades of emergency, conflict and impunity. But more importantly, it is not merely the lack of capacity, but also of political will which continues despite the regime change. In this context, all future steps regarding a criminal investigation must make sure that the current distorted and corrupted Sri Lankan judicial structures be excluded till such time comprehensive reforms have been undertaken, or at the very least such structures' involvement be kept to a bare minimum in what should be a UN-controlled and run criminal justice mechanism. We regret to note, however, that the draft resolution on Sri Lanka that is to be adopted calls for a criminal investigation to be undertaken, but does not seriously address the significant shortcomings detailed in the OHCHR report. The resolution only seeks to provide the appearance of credibility by providing some foreign involvement to what is, for all practical purposes, a domestic mechanism which the OHCHR report very comprehensively rejects. In conclusion, we wish to reiterate the firm conviction of the Tamil people in Sri Lanka who comprise the vast majority of the victims that accountability and justice can only be truly delivered through an international criminal justice mechanism.
Next speaker is Association des Jeunes pour l'Agriculture du Mali. You have the floor.
Mr. President, the war in Sri Lanka came to an end 6 years ago, yet the ethnic conflict still continues today. As the root causes have not to date been addressed, in order to move forward as well as to create genuine reconciliation, it is vital that the root causes of the conflict are addressed. A conducive atmosphere could eliminate the fear and insecure feelings felt among the Tamil people in the island. However, The new government has not shown their political will and commitment to create normalcy in the north and east. As long as military occupation and singular settlements remains in the north and east, it is very difficult to work on genuine reconciliation and accountability. As a result of militarization and singularization throughout the north and east, fear, insecure feelings, and psychology of war continue to dominate the Tamil lives. Also, victims and survivors feel insecure to engage with any justice process. The current land-grabbing plans need to be understood as the calculated outcome of the state policy. The grabbed land is mainly taken for their militarization or colonization purposes. In principle, both militarization and singularization projects are mutually interconnected, and they are specifically designed to complete the annihilation plan of the Tamils as a nation. In addition to the policy, is aimed at eliminating the collective national existence of the Tamils and intends to ensure any future Tamil national revival would never materialize. Therefore, it is imperative for the international community to put pressure on the government of Sri Lanka to recognize that the wide array of international crimes committed by Sri Lankan state apparatus, particularly military, against Tamil as part of a systematic violence against the nation of people. It commends demilitarization and remove state-sponsored single settlements without any further delay. Thank you, President.
Thank you. The next speaker is Association burkinabé pour la survie de l'enfance.
Thank you, President. To have real peace and justice in Sri Lanka, we should remember the natural justice principle: no one ought to be a judge in his own cause. The OHCHR report prepared without able to visit Sri Lanka could able to bring out some of the key violations committed against Tamils are of genocide in nature. The report identifies the failure of Sri Lanka as a state and failure of its constitutional institutions, including judiciary, should be taken seriously, and further criminal investigation need to be commissioned at the international level to independently investigate the crime of genocide of Tamils. In Sri Lanka, there had been nearly 18 commissions of inquiry from 1963, but none could deliver justice. It should be noted that a majority of these commissions were related to the crimes against Tamils. Sri Lanka has long used sovereignty as a defense against international intervention and has executed its genocidal plans on Tamils. Even before the emergence of the LTTE, Sri Lanka had committed multiple genocides on Tamils. The successive governments from 1948 have adopted anti-Tamil stance. The present draft lacks the voice of Tamils. The Maitri Bala Sirisena was leading the government during the final stages of the 2009 war, in which nearly 40,000 Tamils were missing. The genocidal war was used as an instrument to wipe out the sovereignty of Tamils they earned through their 60-year resistance. The Tamil homeland is occupied by the Sri Lankan military with a ratio of 1 soldier for every 6 Tamils, whereas Sri Lankan military composition is 99% Sinhalese. This militarization will not protect the victims or witness who are predominantly Tamil. It's my duty to remind the forum that the Sri Lankan constitution has not endorsed by Tamils. The appointment of Sri Lankan former President Chandra Kumaratunga, whose rule was known for mass graves, as head of the current regime's reconciliation efforts will not deliver justice to Tamils. The Chandrika's regime's mass graves was widely reported in the international press. Events like the above are few examples that can briefly explain why Sri Lanka does not have the capacity to investigate its own crimes. Like elsewhere, let the victims be protected by their own sovereignty to submit their testimony of the crimes committed. We welcome Secretary General's referral of Syria to ICC. Tamil life is also equally precious that of Syrian innocence. In a similar way, let there be an international criminal tribunal for Sri Lanka under UN Charter Article 22 to investigate crime of genocide of Tamils. No one ought to be judged in his own cause. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Association mauritanienne pour la promotion du droit.
Thank you, Chair. We welcome the UN Human Rights Council for remaining focused on the crimes committed in the island of Sri Lanka. Today, I stand before this assembly representing the NGO about. I am also representing the Tamil people as an elected councillor of the Northern Provincial Council in the island of Sri Lanka. I am a direct eyewitness to several crimes from 1983 to date, including the massive genocidal war on Vanni in 2009. On 18 May 2009, I was present in person witnessing how my husband was taken into a bus after being handed over to the Sri Lankan military. I am still searching for my husband. I am one of the thousands of affected victims. I also represent the families of enforced disappeared. I want to express the reservations of the affected victims regarding the hybrid court and the Sri Lankan state becoming a party in the investigation. The state that committed genocide cannot be party to an investigation. The Northern Provincial Council has demanded the independent international investigation on all crimes including genocide. The resolution presented at this assembly ignores the call for international investigation into the main crime against the Tamil people. These proposals also ignore the political question which is the root cause of the conflict. The unitary state system in the island denies Tamils nationhood, sovereignty and right of self-determination. Without this being addressed, there can be no political solution, no justice, no security, no reconciliation for the Tamil people. Therefore, we remain firm in demanding independent international investigation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The next speaker is World Evangelical Alliance.
Mr. President, the World Evangelical Alliance would like to highlight some concerns regarding the freedom of religion in Sri Lanka and the issue of accountability during the final stages of the country's civil war. Since 2012, over 250 incidents of violence, discrimination and intimidation have been recorded against our evangelical communities. Also, in contravention of the law, local government authorities claim that churches are unauthorized, demanding churches to register with the state. A misapplication of the discriminatory circular issued by the Religious Affairs Ministry in 2008 serves as the basis for such demands. Victims of religious persecution are often denied legal recourse owing to negative judicial attitude concerning religious liberty. The courts in most instances pressurize victims and lawyers to settle cases. As a result, there are very few orders given that set a positive precedent in relation to religious freedom. We urge the government of Sri Lanka to withdraw the circular of 2008, ensure justice to victims of religious persecution is done, and take necessary steps to recognize our communities. Mr. President, with regard to an inquiry on the final stages of Sri Lanka's civil war, victims calling on the state's failure to address issues 6 years following the conflict are concerned that a local inquiry will not effectively deal with issues of accountability. Mr. President, we urge the government of Sri Lanka therefore to support an inquiry with adequate involvement of the international community that investigates issues of accountability during the final stages of the war. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is Sirid.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Sulamara Nagaraja and I am a Tamil journalist. I reported on human rights abuses and crime against humanity in the face of danger created by the group that committed them. Since the civil war ended, no real progress has been made towards justice for the Tamil population. Nobody has been held accountable or lawfully punished for the murders of many journalists and the humanitarian activists who were abducted and tortured for trying to reveal the truth about the genocide in Sri Lanka. In many cases, their families still do not know if their loved ones are alive or dead. The United Nations Human Rights Council published a report on 16th of September detailing the war crimes that took place during the civil war. It recommended the creation of a hybrid special court in Sri Lanka in which those responsible for these war crimes will be brought to justice. However, I am here to tell you that such a court is not an acceptable way to seek justice for Tamil people. Figures in the current Sri Lankan president, including the Sri Lankan government, including the president, are implicated in crimes against humanity committed during the civil war. Given their involvement, there can be no real justice for the Tamil people without an independent international investigation. I am using my voice as a journalist and a member of the Tamil community to call for an international independent investigation into the war crimes committed by the Sri Lankan government during the civil war. This is the last hope we have for the lives of those remaining Tamils who are still in fear and under difficult and uncertain circumstances in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you. That was the last speaker on my list, but I understand the Deputy High Commissioner wants to take the floor to answer some questions.
Thank you, Mr. President. Yes, I would like to address some of the questions that have been posed. But before that, let me start by expressing the appreciation that we have towards the recognition of the report that the investigation has put together. A report that was faced with time, resources, access constraints, and that would not have been possible without the contribution of victims, witnesses, members of civil society, human rights defenders who have contributed information and evidence, sometimes, in fact, often under extremely difficult circumstances and at the risk of their own well-being. I believe we do have to recognize their contributions as having been essential to the conduct and completion of this report. As the High Commissioner has said, the environment in Sri Lanka from the time this Council gave OHCHR the mandate to conduct this investigation until now has seen, since the elections in January 2015, a change, a considerable change, a change that you have also, distinguished members of the Council, acknowledged in terms of the commitment that was expressed in his statements by Foreign Minister Samarawira of the government's intention to undertake a comprehensive approach to dealing with the past. Additionally, to that, the engagement that we, as the Office of the High Commissioner, have been able to re-establish with the Sri Lanka authorities gives us hope that we will be able together and with the assistance of the international community to finally start to address consistently, accountably, transparently the issues that still remain open, the wounds that still are open after the painful events during the internal war. In that respect, and in response to some questions that were posed about the possible role of the office in support of the efforts in Sri Lanka, we are prepared and indeed keen to continue to provide technical advice and support with respect to a number of key tasks that the government has committed to undertaking, notably the need to have an extensive consultation process leading to the design of a fair, credible, transparent mechanism to assure accountability for past crimes. Additionally, and as has been recognized by many, the justice sector is in need of considerable reform, legislative reform, particularly with respect of the Counterterrorism Act, is also an important area where our office would be able to provide support, as is the broader set of activities required for truth, reconciliation, and guarantee for non-recurrence to really take root in a stable, peaceful Sri Lanka. In that respect, we have already a small presence in the country. A human rights advisor is about to be fielded. The government has welcomed this engagement, and we look forward, within the limits of our resources, to continue to strengthen these cooperations. We have also seen on the part of the government a readiness to welcome special procedures. The Special Rapporteur on Transitional Justice, the Working Group on Enforced Disappearances, are already actively engaged, one having visited, Special Rapporteur having visited in March, April, and the Working Group looking forward to visiting in November. Other special procedures could also be helpful in contributing to the further work. just by way of the ones that come to mind are Special Rapporteur on torture, on extrajudicial killings, and so on. Certainly, an open invitation to all special procedures would be particularly welcome. Additionally, and going to the point of what this Council could do, it would be important to continue for this Council to devote attention to the development in Sri Lanka, to support progress, and to provide support, whether bilaterally, whether through the multilateral channels of the United Nations, but in a manner that is coherent, coordinated, and where the respective contributions by leveraging each other's impact can result in an outcome that is more than just a simple sum of the individual parts. I think I have addressed, I hope somewhat adequately, the questions that have been posed. Let me conclude by saying that the High Commissioner is personally very committed to the continuation of dialogue and of cooperation with Sri Lanka, and does look forward to visiting at a time mutually suitable to both parties, with a view to contributing constructively to the further strengthening of the work towards accountability and peaceful, respectful for human rights of all in the country. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. President. This is Dr. Anbumani Ramadas, Member of Parliament and former Health Minister, Government of India, welcoming the OASL report on behalf of Pasumai Thayagam Foundation. I speak on behalf of the 77 million people of Tamil Nadu in India who are concerned about the welfare, rights and dignity of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. We thank the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for their strong and comprehensive report on the war crimes and crimes against humanity committed during and after the war in Sri Lanka. As High Commissioner stated in his report that for accountability to be achieved in Sri Lanka, more than a domestic mechanism is needed. Sri Lanka has categorically stated that only a domestic mechanism would be allowed. This is a challenge thrown at the OASL's report, needing a proper response, keeping in mind the inadequate joint resolution tabled is not fulfilling the aspirations of the victims. Sri Lanka stands accused, and it has no moral authority to judge its own crimes. As stated in the report, we note that even the new government did not allow the OASL team to visit Sri Lanka. Tamils still languish as internally displaced persons. Army camps are located in Tamil villages. Land grabbed from the Tamils are yet to be returned. Rape and torture continue, and Tamil people still live in fear. The high security zones remain. We also bring to attention the resolution passed by the Tamil Nadu State Assembly in India on September 16, 2015, that called on India to move a strong resolution at the UNHRC seeking an international probe against Sri Lankan government's human rights violation and war crimes. The silence of the government of India to the pleas of the people of Tamil Nadu for demanding an international inquiry is highly disappointing. Pasumai Thayagam urges UNHRC to set up offices in the north and east of Sri Lanka to give adequate witness protection. We call upon the international community to establish an international judicial process and accountability mechanism to ensure credible justice is done in Sri Lanka. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Next speaker is Liberation.
Thank you, President. We give a cautious but hopeful welcome to this resolution. We thank the High Commissioner and his team for the report, a historic document in promoting truth, justice and accountability for all the persons, peoples in Sri Lanka. How far this new mechanism proposed in this draft resolution will prove to be credible and serve truth, justice and accountability will depend largely on the sincere and genuine cooperation of the Sri Lankan government. The victims of war understandably have no confidence in leaving implementation of the High Commissioner's report to the government of Sri Lanka and its own local mechanism. It is the international component of this proposed mechanism and the sincere and genuine cooperation of the new government as promised by its foreign ministers give us confidence. Tamils have been admittedly let down more than once by the UN in not stopping the massacre of so many civilians during the war. Here is a chance for this Council to act as guardian and guarantor for the future conduct and cooperation of one of the members of the UN. The new government has shown some signs of goodwill, but not shown yet the needed courage and strength to rectify all the injustices still suffered by the victims of the war. A clear example, even under this new government, is instead of demilitarization of the Tamil areas, there is further escalation of army presence. We wish much sincerity, goodwill and courage to all leaders of this August Assembly in Geneva to continue its active vigilance on Sri Lanka, as well as to the political and civic leaders of all the people in Sri Lanka to grasp this opportunity and move meaningfully to reconciliation and peace. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Civicus.
President, Civicus congratulates the High Commissioner and his staff on the quality of the report on the OHCHR investigation on Sri Lanka. We note the seriousness of the findings that finally bring to the official attention of the Council the desperate plight of civilians caught up in the tragic events of the closing stages of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka some 6.5 years ago. Civicus recalls that, in the words of the UN Secretary General, all victims of human rights abuses should be able to look at the Human Rights Council as a forum and a springboard for action. Regrettably, the Council has failed far too long to respond to the legitimate expectations of several 100,000 such victims in Sri Lanka. Civicus is particularly concerned over the unprecedented exclusion of all independent observers, domestic and international alike, including representatives of the UN systems, from the war zones. This created conditions that allowed for the mass violations of human rights and was clearly part of a deliberate policy to silence critics and human rights defenders. Members of the Council will recall that acts of intimidation were brought into this very building in an effort to avoid the devastating facts described in the OHCHR report from reaching the Council. The OHCHR report and the far-reaching recommendations of the High Commissioner, together with the peaceful democratic transition underway in Sri Lanka since the beginning of this year, provides the Council with the opportunity finally to assume its responsibilities and to take action in support of the victims who, against great odds, have continued to place confidence in the international community through the Human Rights Council. In recognition of the new spirit of cooperation adopted by the newly established government, the Council must now find ways of accompanying Sri Lanka in the fulfillment of all its commitments to the people of Sri Lanka. Whilst welcoming the action now envisioned by the government and by the Human Rights Council, Civicus underlines the essential role of a vibrant, independent and unconstrained civil society
the next speaker
in ensuring
is Commission to Study the Organization of Peace. Commission to Study the Organization of Peace has the floor. Not present, then it's Human Rights Watch next.
Thank you, Mr. President. The High Commissioner's investigative report on Sri Lanka marks a significant step towards justice and accountability for the victims of international crimes and the family members of Sri Lanka's dead and disappeared. The International Investigative Team extensively documented alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity, including torture, extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances. Now the government of Sri Lanka and the international community need to engage credibly, promptly and transparently to see these recommendations implemented. The Sri Lankan government has accepted many recommendations to improve the human rights situation, including a repeal of the draconian Prevention of Terrorism Act and reforms to the Witness and Victim Protection Law, both long called for by victims' rights groups. The government has also agreed to accelerate the return of lands confiscated by the security forces, to end the divisive military involvement in civilian activities in the country's north and east, to investigate allegations of attacks on civil society, media and religious minorities, and to work towards devolution of authority. Among the report's concrete recommendations is the establishment of a special court, integrating international judges, prosecutors, lawyers and investigators, with an independent Sri Lankan investigative and prosecuting body. The endorsement in the resolution under consideration at the session of a judicial mechanism with international participation is an important recognition of the need for an international role to ensure justice for victims. This participation must be meaningful, not tokenistic or a facade. Sri Lanka's government, through its co-sponsorship of the resolution, is making important promises to all the victims of Sri Lanka's long civil war. However, effective foreign participation and international engagement will be needed to build trust and confidence in the process, which is necessary for a successful outcome. We urge the government of Sri Lanka to implement the important investigative report recommendation to support the establishment of a dedicated OHCHR office in the country. And we would encourage the High Commissioner to keep the Council regularly updated on developments through both formal and informal briefings. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Amnesty International.
Thank you, President. I am Dr. Manoharan. On 2nd of January 2006, the Sri Lankan STF murdered my beloved son Rajigar on beach in Trincomalee. Today, 9 long years have passed since my son's murder without no judgment from Sri Lankan courts. My family and I had to leave the country as they are not witness protection. Thank you to the Human Rights Council for supporting this Sri Lankan report. Our case, the Trinco 5 in case in Trincomalee protection. I beg to the good on promise to the witness family. The Sri Lankan need to help from the international community. Thank you, President.
Thank you. The next speaker is Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada.
Thank you, Mr. President, Excellencies, and I think everyone here will join me in thanking the last speaker for his very difficult remarks. Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada welcomes the report on Sri Lanka by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and we thank the High Commissioner and his office for taking the detailed report, and we also sincerely thank the witnesses who made this report possible, taking incredible risks and reliving their harrowing experiences in order to provide the evidence. The long-awaited report finally acknowledges that grave human rights violations committed in Sri Lanka amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We welcome the High Commissioner's strong recommendations about the kind of measures Sri Lanka must undertake to achieve true accountability and reconciliation. One of the most significant recommendations contained in the report is the establishment of a special hybrid court with significant international involvement. The Sri Lankan government, with good reason, lacks the basic trust of the predominantly Tamil war-affected population, and without such trust, any domestic accountability mechanism would lack credibility and meaning. This lack of trust was created in part by a history of failed initiatives, systemic and institutional deficiencies resulting from entrenched discrimination against Tamils, a repressive regime, and a 30-year conflict. Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada therefore calls upon members of the Human Rights Council to pass a resolution that explicitly adopts the recommendations of the High Commissioner, guarantees strict timelines for progress to be made, and ensures that Sri Lanka remains an item on the international agenda. Any accountability process must have significant international involvement, including, at a minimum, having a majority of the judges, prosecutors, and investigators appointed from outside Sri Lanka, using international law, and having an independent and internationally overseen witness and victim protection scheme. We believe that a domestic process is unacceptable and unfit to address the grievances of the Tamil people. Mr. President, the Human Rights Council stands at a critical juncture with respect to Sri Lanka, and it is imperative that they do not fall victims and communities now. Thank you.
Our next speaker is League of Persons with Disabilities Rights Group.
Thank you, Mr. President. Minority Rights Group welcomes the OHCHR report, and in particular its crucial drawing of attention to the impact of the war on minorities in the country. As the report duly underlines, minority women were uniquely affected by the conflict, which included widespread sexual violence inseparable from a broader systemic pattern of gender-based violence against Tamil women. MRG is also encouraged by attention directed to atrocities suffered specifically by the Muslim population at the hands of the Sri Lankan military and the LTTE. However, MRG would like to stress that it is not only a matter of past atrocities. Years after the formal end of the conflict, impunity persists, and the situation remains grave for minority women. Amidst pervasive military presence in the north and east, many face chronic insecurity, protracted displacement, land grabbing, and the threats of sexual violence. Thousands of women who have lost family members to death and disappearances are sole breadwinners and, faced with limited livelihood opportunities, they are vulnerable to exploitation. Meanwhile, the Muslim community in particular, but also Christians, have faced violent attacks and hate speech fueled by mounting religious extremism. Considering this context, MRG endorses the call for the establishment of a hybrid special court to investigate war crimes. However, despite growing debate and discussion on reconciliation in Sri Lanka, Tamil women continue to be sidelined. Without a clear framework of protection or inclusion in place for minority women and other marginalized groups, the prospects of reconciliation and a lasting peace will remain elusive. MRG therefore recommends that the government of Sri Lanka ensure relevant SRSG and other UN special procedures have access to the country and establish a platform for affected minority women to share their experiences and engage in meaningful dialogue on transitional justice in Sri Lanka. I thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Mr. President, Forum Asia welcomes the OHCHR and OISL reports and endorses their findings. We express serious concern on the gross and systemic crimes they indicate, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. We urge the government and people of Sri Lanka and the international community to address the findings of the report and fully implement its recommendations. Despite some change, oppressive structures, policies and practices continue in Sri Lanka. Harassment and intimidation of human rights defenders and war victims continue in the north and the east, alongside military occupation of civilian land as well as torture and sexual abuse. Disappearances all over the country remain unaccounted for, and people continue to be arrested under the Abusive Prevention of Terrorism Act. Very little has been done in the last few months to address any of this. We note the commitments made by the government to the Council and reiterate that concrete results and not promises will make a difference to survivors and their families and generate confidence, particularly given broken promises and U-turns in the past. Success of accountability mechanisms will depend on the confidence Sri Lankan people have in them, especially survivors and victims' families, and the extent to which their insights are included in the design and implementation and oversight of such mechanisms. Noting the government's acknowledgement to the Council of the weaknesses of Sri Lankan institutions, we agree with the High Commissioner that Sri Lanka's criminal justice system is not ready to pursue accountability through a domestic process. We call on the government and the international community to work together towards an accountability mechanism that has, at minimum, a sole international prosecutor and a majority of international judges, lawyers, and investigators appointed independently. It's imperative that war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide are criminalized domestically with retrospective effect. Furthermore, UN member states should fully implement recommendations addressed to them, including by applying universal jurisdiction to prosecute those responsible for serious violations. These reports are important milestones, but the difference they make to Sri Lanka will depend on follow-up. Thus, this Council must continue to regularly assess progress and, in the event of a failure, consider further international action to ensure accountability. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. The next speaker is International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism.
Thank you, Mr. President. IMADA and Rights Now Collective welcome the OISL report and the recommendations of the High Commissioner. We regret that it took 6 long years for the international community to recognize these violations. These include war crimes, crimes against humanity and gruesome gender-based violence committed by both sides during the conflict. Local and international NGOs, including victims and survivors, continuously called upon this Council to investigate into these incidents. Some member states supported the previous regime using the blanket of sovereignty. IMADA has worked with all stakeholders, including the diaspora, for many years amidst threats and risks to lives of our leadership and activists. We are witnessing the new hope in Sri Lanka, as all communities converge to map out a path for peace, reconciliation and restoration of dignity for all citizens. The era of constitutional authoritarianism, perpetuated using the language of sovereignty by the former regime, has been defeated by the people. The struggle to uphold human rights, democracy and rule of law has won the day. We congratulate the new political leadership in Sri Lanka for acknowledging the need to address the challenges for human rights and justice. As the High Commissioner stated, it is imperative that government seizes unique opportunity. It has to break the mold of impunity once and for all. The OISL concluded that incidents of sexual violence were not isolated acts, but that is part of an institutional policy within the security forces. We urge the GSL to fully implement all recommendations effectively and in a meaningful manner. This requires legal and security sector reforms and a hybrid ad hoc tribunal.
We also urge USL to consider signing the Rome Statute. It is important that all documents are translated accurately into Sinhala and Tamil to assist in a constructive dialogue. The time has come for healing wounds, seeking justice. IMODA will support all efforts together with victims,
Thank you very
survivors.
much. Time
Thank
is
you
up.
very much.
The next speaker is International Commission of Jurists.
Thank you, Mr. President. The ICJ welcomes the OHCHR report documenting alleged serious violations and abuses of human rights and related crimes during the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, and commends the investigation team for its historic contribution towards reconciliation and the realization of victims' rights. The ICJ works around the world to address impunity and victims' right to remedy for violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including in situations of transition. For over 30 years, the ICJ has documented and reported on a gradual erosion of judicial independence and impartiality under successive governments in Sri Lanka and the resulting culture of impunity. The ICJ considers the International Criminal Court to be the preferred mechanism for individual accountability where national authorities lack the capacity or the willingness to genuinely investigate and prosecute all war crimes and crimes against humanity. In the absence of an ICC process, the ICJ's experience demonstrates that any credible and effective accountability process in Sri Lanka must involve, at a minimum, a majority of international judges, prosecutors, and investigators. The ICJ therefore welcomes the High Commissioner's recommendation for a hybrid court and prosecutor's office that fully integrates international judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and investigators. Also essential are the OHCHR's recommendations on the mandate and resources of these mechanisms, legislating international crimes under national law, justice and security sector reform, repealing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, strengthening the Witness and Victim Protection Act, accession to the Disappearances Convention, and continued monitoring of implementation through an OHCHR country office and by the Council. The ICJ welcomes that the tabled draft resolution explicitly recognizes the need for international judges, prosecutors, lawyers, and investigators. We call on the Council to adopt the resolution with, and call on the government of Sri Lanka to urgently implement these and other key elements of the recommendations of the High Commissioner's report in full. Thank you, Mr. President.